Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend, and welcome to episode 103 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. Today, I am bringing you a conversation that I had with my friend Shannon Polk. I am going to be honest, this was not the episode that we had planned for today. We actually plan out our content several months in advance, and this was not the topic nor the episode I was planning to have. But in light of all of the current events that are happening and that have happened in the past few weeks related to the issue of racism in our country, I knew that I wanted to bring this topic to the podcast, and I knew that I couldn't speak to it on my own. And when I thought of who I would want to bring on as a guest to share, I thought of Shannon. Shannon and I met in person last fall. We were able to have lunch at the Hope Writers Conference, and I was able to learn about her background and her experiences and her expertise. And so I am honored that when I reached out very last minute and asked her if she would be willing to be on the podcast, she said yes. So this is a longer conversation than usual. I know our episodes aren't always very short, but this one is more than an hour long. But I really hope and pray that you are willing to listen through to the end. I really don't want to cut out any parts of our conversation because Shannon shares some really valuable and incredible insights in her own leadership journey, and I don't want to skip that. But then we dive into the issue of race and what is going on in our country now, as well as some of the historical issues that have led to where we are now. We also talk about the practical ways that the church can and should be responding to racism, and just the nitty-gritty of what you personally can be doing. And so I really think this will be enlightening and encouraging to you. If you are open to learning and listening, then tune in to this full conversation. Now, you can learn more about Shannon and about her expertise and her links and all the resources that we discuss in the show notes for this episode. You can find those at estherlittlefield.com/episode 103. So let's go ahead and dive into our conversation with Shannon Polk. Welcome, Shannon, to the podcast. I am so happy to have you here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. And I reached out to you very last minute to ask you to be on the podcast. And we're going to be talking about some difficult things today, but some important things about race and leadership and just in the Christian church, how we can do better. But before we get into all of that, I would love to have you share with our listeners just a little bit about yourself and how you are currently leading in your life right now.
Sure. So right now I am an associate pastor at Riverside Tabernacle. It's an Assembly of God church located in downtown Flint, Michigan. I've been on staff now going on 3, maybe, I don't know. Everything feels really long right now, doesn't it?
Yes. It's very hard to know what time or year we're in, really.
Exactly. But I went to seminary at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary in Springfield, Missouri. And after I got my doctorate of ministry degree there, my pastor said, hey, now that you're a fully minted doctor, we want you to come on staff. And I was like, oh, this sounds great. And so I've been serving there. Part of my role is being on the preaching team and sharing. I actually preached last Sunday.
Oh, wow.
I also preached this Sunday before they closed all the churches. in my state. So it's been quite a journey that way in
Yeah.
leading. We're in the process of merging. The church I attend is predominantly white congregation, and we're in the process of merging with a predominantly Black congregation. I've been helping to lead those conversations to make sure that we're all ready to merge. We were fortunate that I had some materials from Latasha Morrison's organization, Be the Bridge. They had some
Yeah.
really great curriculum that we used with our staff to talk about some issues to help us get ready for this merger, both from an organizational standpoint, but particularly from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah. Wow.
And also, this year, I am currently president of the Junior League of Flint. So I am a junior leaguer.
That's
So
awesome.
that's really interesting. A lot of us been talking about what it means to lead a women's organization in the time of Corona.
Yeah.
And
Right.
where we thought initially our biggest issue is going to be how are we going to do in-person meetings? How are we going to do our volunteer stuff? If we can't get out into the community. But with everything that happened over the past couple of weeks, now we have even more things to consider and think about as we lead.
Wow.
So
Yeah. Okay. Wow. You are doing a lot. I believe you also have a law practice too. Is that correct?
right. So my mother was very adamant about not having any more preachers or ministers in her family. So when I wanted to go to a Christian college, she said no. And I attended Michigan State instead. She told me to go get a real job, not any of that ministry stuff. And so I did, which led me then to law school. And so I do practice law, not full time because just schedule being a mom, being a wife, but I do practice part time estate planning.
Okay.
So, which
Yeah.
is something that's fortunately I have a degree that gives me some flexibility into my
Right.
work schedule. So that's been really good.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing all the things you're doing. It's quite impressive and quite amazing to me. You just shared briefly a little bit of your background, but I'd love for you just to take us back in time, even maybe to your childhood, and share how you realized you were a leader and maybe a little bit about your leadership journey that brought you to being a pastor and being a lawyer and all the things.
Okay. So, for me, if I look back, even as a child, back in the day when they used to give Easter speeches, I always wanted the longest one and the hardest one, right? I wanted to push myself. I wanted to see
Mm,
what I could do and I wanted to prove myself. And then in school, we need somebody to volunteer. Well, my hand was always raised. I'll do it. I'll speak in front of the class. I'll volunteer to do this. And the interesting thing about it was that at the school I attended was very ethnically diverse and economically diverse. And so that gave me a chance to feel like I could compete with anybody. It didn't matter what their parents did for a living, it didn't matter what my parents did for a living, that I could compete and I would. And when it came to debate, I didn't care that your dad was an attorney or a judge. Come on, let's go. I've got an argument and mine is the best. And so being a big mouth kid, I remember being a Christian, accepting Christ at an early age. So then my thought was, I got to go evangelize the entire classroom now. All these kids in my school need to find Jesus so they don't go to hell. And so just this thought of, I know some stuff and I need to share this stuff. I know it wasn't always easy. Going to a public school painted a really big target on my back. I truly was that little Jesus freak who went to school, had her Bible in her backpack, but felt like I had something to say.
yeah.
And I was fortunate that I had some teachers, some men, some women who were like, I see something in this kid. Let's let her go for it. And they let me do stuff. And I look back on some of the things that they let me do and think to myself, why would you let a 14-year-old get up in front of a class and say that? Why would you let a 16-year-old do that? Like, what were you thinking? And, I was fortunate that I had a pastor at my church who didn't necessarily believe in women behind the pulpit, but he's like, okay, you got to talk. Let me have you do the announcements. Every time we need something said, you're going to get up here and you're going to speak when we have district meetings and district conferences. And so just that kind of encouragement. But I think I also had a lot of encouragement from my grandmother and my mother. My mother I think she just was more of a behind the scenes kind of person.
Mm,
And so it gave her a lot of joy to be like, there's my baby up there doing that. And so she would quietly go, I think you should try that. I think you should do that. It wasn't her personality. She was very, kind of shy in that respect. And my grandmother felt like she didn't have the educational resources to do some of that.
mm,
But they were like, we're going to let you go as far and as fast. And I'll never forget being in college and the three of us loved to go shopping together. And this woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, what a cute young co-ed. I know your mom and your grandma are going to be so excited when you meet that boy on campus and get married and have a family." And without batting an eye, both my grandmother and my mom turned to me and said, "No, you don't need to get married. You don't need to have a kid. You need education." And so there was always this really strong push in my family from the women of go be really smart,
Mm.
go do things, go
Yeah.
lead. And I think it also helped that my father was, the only way I can describe him is my dad was an early feminist. Like, he's like, well, why can't you run for office? Well, why can't you have a company? You know, I'm
Yeah.
not teaching you how to have a secretary. I'm not teaching you how to be a secretary. I'm teaching you how to have a secretary. I mean, that was his whole thought. Like, you don't need to learn how to type. And I'm thinking to myself, great. You know, I was like, he had no idea the technological revolution was coming. Dude, that was a skill. I should have taken typing instead of German. But his whole point in that was, I'm teaching you to be a CEO. And that's where I see you. That's your gifting. Those are your talents. I don't think either of my parents would have been disappointed if I had not done something in leadership. I just think they saw that as natural giftings. And that was just strongly encouraged. My dad often said about his mom, he often said that my grandfather, who was a pastor, he said he would have been a bishop if they would have let my grandmother be the bishop. Like, just this idea that, you know, she was a go-getter and, you know, she led on state levels, women's meetings and in children's ministry. She was the state children's ministry coordinator for her denomination. Just this idea that we are women and there is a place for us in the body and there's a place for us outside of the body, you know, whether it's
Right.
running a business. And so I was just strongly encouraged to do that. And I remember those couple of times I would run into guys who were like, that's not what you're supposed to do. And I would think to myself, aren't you an odd little person? Okay, let's move on to the next person. I, I
Because you
just,
hadn't heard that in your experience, that wasn't common.
no, it wasn't common. And I didn't really start seeing that until, until college.
Yeah.
And I was shocked that people thought that women couldn't lead. And I knew I didn't necessarily see it a lot, especially in the church, but there were at least two or three. And that I could go and I could talk to and I could ask questions. And there were some men, you know, they didn't want me necessarily leading at certain levels, but they're like, she's got a gift. And we can't deny that. And we have to make space for that giftedness. And I saw women who owned their own businesses, whether they were the woman who owned her own hair salon or, you know, so it was just always the thought of, well, of course you can. Why wouldn't you do that? And, you know, I come from a long line of very outspoken women. Very truth to power was just the dinner table conversation. So, you know, when I was on campus, I led organizations. Afterwards, I didn't, growing up Black in an urban context, I didn't realize that there was this Christian bubble that really, really limited the roles of women. And when I met my husband, who is, as I like to say, extremely white, you know, and he talked to me about growing up, being homeschooled for a period of time, going to Christian schools his entire life, living in this suburban Reformed theological community where the outline and the defined role of women was really restricted. I just looked and I was like, well, what do y'all do with Deborah? Well, what do you do with Mary Mac? Like, I just had real. Well, what about all those women that are VPs at Fortune 500? Like, what do you do with those women? And that began a great explanation because I didn't understand that.
Yeah.
I didn't get it. Yeah. And I think in some ways I still don't.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you said he grew up in your area or somewhere else.
Yes.
Where did you meet?
Yeah. So I grew up in the city of Flint and he
Yeah.
grew up in a suburb of Flint.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we met at a Bible study. His pastor and I happened to be friends. We would run into each other at Starbucks a lot. You know, Starbucks, the safe place you can go when you don't go to clubs, right?
Right,
So
right.
Christian people can get to stay up late and not have to go to the movie. So his pastor invited me to a Bible study. And I looked at his pastor, this really nice Southern man, originally from Texas, spoke with this deep drawl. And I said, Pastor Larry, am I going to be the only Black person at this Bible study? Like, you know, just give it to me straight. Because I don't understand why you're inviting me to this Bible study. You know, I'm not Baptist. I'm very Pentecostal.
Yeah.
you know that I preach. I know how you, I mean, like, why are you inviting me? He's like, just come. I think it'll be good. Hindsight being 2020, what I realize now is that they had a slew of guys at that church that were single. And Pastor Larry was looking for nice, good Christian girls he could introduce to these nice young Christian boys at his church. And I got caught up. That's what happened.
Yeah. It was a setup.
Totally and completely. And I am forever grateful.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome. I love that. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that background. I think it's just so inspiring to hear how many people encourage your leadership gifts, because I think that's not always women's experiences, girls' experiences growing up. And it's always inspiring to hear that you had people who poured into you, and it doesn't sound like you ever believed that it wasn't possible for you to be a leader.
Until my late 20s, where I started running into people that were like, that had an age limit. Like, this is when ministry starts. You really should be doing ministry before this age. And that felt like, oh, I actually had a pastor of the church I was attending at the time say, you'd be great in our youth if only you were married. But we don't let single people sit in that role, especially not a single woman. And I had never run into that. And I was devastated. And it made me second guess my calling. It made me second guess my abilities. And it started a long journey of doubt.
Wow. Okay.
A journey of trying to figure out, well, where do I fit? Because up until this point, it's been go, run as fast as you can. And I am running into brick wall after brick wall after brick wall. And a friend of mine who sent me over the manuscript of a book she's writing on prayer. And I just got to the chapter on perspective. And she said, sometimes you're running into things and the prayer you need to pray is not for God to change it, for God to give you his perspective on the situation. And as I look back on it, I should have been asking God, why? And I think the why was so that I could talk to women who've run into those walls. When you've never had a problem in the area and someone says they have a problem, you're always kind of like, well, just shake it off. Just do something else. But when you've run into that and you've had that same hurdle, it gives you different kind of empathy for the struggle. And if I had that smooth sailing the whole time, I wouldn't have that empathy. So I began to be in situations where people were like, well, women don't do that. I had a boss who I had asked for a raise because at this point I was his senior most staff member. And the typical thing was when you're the senior most staff member, there's some things you get pay wise and so forth. And he sent me a memo, and the memo outlined how most women are in poverty because they're not married. And that if I really wanted to change my financial situation, I should get a husband. Yeah.
Wow.
So you're
they can't see my face,
his
but
face,
I'm just
right?
like, no, I just
like what?
Yeah.
Right. And so I began to run into these walls, and it was truly disheartening because I couldn't understand how, if I'm doing the same work, if I'm performing at the same level, if I'm giving the same output, I'm putting in the same hours, how does that not justify the same rate of pay, the same title? Like, that's really odd to me. And so I began to learn some lessons from that. And the first lesson, which was the hardest to learn, was go where you're celebrated, not where you're tolerated, right? Like, get out of these bad situations because you're going to be frustrated in your soul because these people don't get it. And you're going to constantly be hitting your head up against the wall. And as one of my executive coaches told me once, you can try to fit into the culture here. The problem is who you are is eventually going to leak out. And so just be honest and just say, you know what? I thought this was a good fit. It's not a good fit. Let me find the right place. And so the Lord allowed me opportunity to serve in some different ministries, but they weren't the right fit. And it was interesting because even in some of those churches where the senior pastor was like, you have a gift. I see their culture was such where they're like, but we don't use women in those roles. And they would say, I just don't know what to do with you.
Right.
Because you're so talented, but we don't let women serve in these capacities. So I don't want to stifle your gift. They almost kind of remind you of Gamaliel, like, we don't want to be seen opposing God. But at the same time, we're just going to kind of take a step back. We're just going to watch from a distance, see what happens. And so I'm so grateful that God used my husband to lead me to the ministry where I am now, because when I went to that congregation, first thing I did was had a meeting with the pastors, like, look, I'm in seminary, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And he looked at me, he's like, so what do you feel like God is calling you to do here? And I was like, what? He said, what do you think God would want to do with your ministry here? And I was so shocked because it had been years since someone spoke to me with that level of openness.
Wow. Yeah.
And then he looked at me after I kind of shared a couple things and he said, whatever God wants to do with you here, I am open to whatever God wants to do. That meant there were no limits.
Yeah.
That meant however God wanted to use you. Now he's faithful for saying, and he said to me after, he said, now, if God wants you here, I want you here. But if he doesn't want you here, I need you to find the door. He said, because I only want what God wants.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But that means I want whatever God wants, which means if God wants to use you in a leadership position, I'm open for that. If God just wants you here because he needs to heal your heart from some of those other wounds, then that's great too. And if there's a time that God wants you to move on to something else, then I want that for your life, which is such a healthy perspective for women to hear that, you know what, I want what God wants for you. And he has been a gem. He asked me to do something at the time my daughter was about 2. And whatever he asked me to do, my daughter just was not having it. It was like a late service. And she was just like, I'm over this. It's past my bedtime. Like, dude, you know my routine. And I'll never forget him coming to me after that and saying, I will never ask you to do that again because you're the mother of a young child. And God didn't ask you to do this over here and stop being a mom and stop being a wife. So talk to me about how we need to adjust your schedule to make this work. And so I just feel like, we've got to be in environments where people see all of who we are, where we're allowed to bring that full self, because I think there's wisdom I gained as a mom. There's wisdom that I've gained as a wife that helps me be a better leader. It helps me bring up things when we're in a board meeting that other people wouldn't see because they're not sitting in that seat. And so if we want to really release women to do all that God has created them to do, we need to let them lead with all of who they are and not have them have to hide, those different roles. Like, oh my goodness, what happens if I have to bring my daughter, to a meeting? Because I might have to.
Right.
Let's be honest, women bear the brunt of childcare, even in the most egalitarian of households, right? There's still that 51-49% that tilts towards the one that carried the baby, or, what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like, so just recognize that and making space for that, making space to understand that that actually is a value add to our leadership and not a negative. And that there is a sensitivity and an empathy. There is a decisiveness. When you're chasing somebody who's about to put something in their mouth that they shouldn't, like, you don't have time to wait. So there are things we learn in these roles. There are things we learn with having to navigate a menses once a month that allows us to be people who with great forethought, right? And backup plans.
Yes.
That our brothers don't, just because these are the unique challenges.
Right.
There are things we understand about safety and security that don't always come up in the minds of the brethren, not because they don't care, but because these are things that maybe they've never had to think about. And so I'm in charge of our safety plan. Why? Because I'm a woman and I'm a mom. And so I get safety at a different level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so letting us bring all those skills, not hiding any of that, not hiding who we are, but saying, you know what? We're amazing because of these things. God made us this way and it's good.
Yeah. I love that so much. And I can't even remember what episode it was, but way back in the beginning, Holly and I talked about women leading and the idea of not trying to be like men in leadership, actually owning our femaleness in our leadership, because we do, like you're saying, we're bringing a different perspective and neither one is right or wrong. It's different. We need the men and they need us.
Let me tell you this quick story. When you said that, it just brought it back to mind. So, they have different ways in my denomination for getting your ministerial credentials. And one of them is attending these classes locally. And they had this class that was required that you had to attend. And it was on February 14th. Now, you're laughing, and you're laughing for the same reason I was upset. And so I get to this class and I tell the person who at that point was over this, I said, look, this is ridiculous. I said, there's no way you should be having a class this weekend. I said, because you've got all these young guys in here who are newly married and they're just so on fire and want to do something for God. And you know what? you are setting a poor precedent for them, because right now there is a wife who is ticked off at the fact that she should be somewhere with roses and chocolates and a great meal and a cute outfit. And instead, her man is here with you all. I said, do you know what today is? Do you know what this weekend is? And the guy kind of looked at me. I said, it's Valentine's Day. I said, and there's not an American woman who grew up in going to school who does not know what this date is. Okay. I said, so I don't even want to be here. And it was really funny because after I said that, they never again held that class that weekend.
Yeah.
But again, there wasn't a woman in the room to say, don't teach that guy that he has to choose ministry over marriage, ministry over family. Don't do that. Start now while he's young in ministry, helping him set the path and set the routine and the lifestyle that is going to have him have a healthy marriage, a healthy family, and a healthy ministry. But that's why you need women at that table. That's why you need diverse voices at that table that can say that.
Yeah.
I mean, the guys weren't being intentionally insensitive. It's just Valentine's Day wasn't a big deal to them. But if you're a newlywed, Valentine's Day is a big deal. All the days are a big deal. You know, maybe if you got 20 years in, you're not, maybe, I don't know, maybe you're not thinking about it. But trust me, year 0 to 5, you're thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, and like you're saying, I think that so many times we've had conversations on this podcast about the issue of boundaries and leadership, and specifically in ministry, how so often ministry ends up coming before the marriage, before the family. And it's really, really sad. And I think you make a great point that it often could be that there just isn't that female voice in the room when some of these planning sessions or decisions are being made, that if there was that voice, it could help them just rethink it, maybe look at it a little differently. So I appreciate you sharing that. So Shannon, I remember when we sat down for lunch at Hope Writers Conference back in the fall last year, and it was just so great to meet you in person and talk with you. And so I remember when you shared you got your doctor of ministry, and I believe you looked at the issue of women of color or racial issues in the church. Is that right?
That is. My doctoral work was on creating pathways to leadership for women of color ministers within my denomination. But, you know, it's applied to women of color leading in predominantly white organizations.
Okay. Yeah. So obviously we're in June 2020, and the past couple of weeks, as you mentioned earlier, have been just very devastating in so many ways. And as I thought about trying to speak to this topic, I realized that I am completely inadequate to speak to it in my own experience of growing up in Maine, which is one of the whitest states in the nation. And I thought of you because I would love, I remembered our conversation, and I know that you have a different perspective and one that is very valuable to me. So I appreciate you being willing to come on, because I know that there's just so much going on, and it's hard.
Yeah.
So I guess I would like to start the conversation by just having you share your perspective on the current events of, obviously, the death of George Floyd and the response of the church. How should we be responding as the church to the current events that are involving the racial tensions in our country?
You know, it's interesting. When I did my research, and I'm going to start there, how many experiences were similar if you were either a person of color or if you were a woman?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
In the sense that I think about the Me Too movement, right? How long did it take for women to be heard on this issue? How long did it take for people to really believe them, to believe that, so that really happened? That person really treated you that way? They really harassed you in that way? That's horrible. That's awful. How could that have really happened? And you had thousands of women speaking out at different levels, right? And so those that had visibility had to be willing to share their stories, had to be willing to lend their credibility to the issue so that people would take it seriously. And then we had the Me Too movement inside the church, like, hey, and it's not just in Hollywood, it's here in the church too. And people are like, You mean a pastor would say that to a parishioner? A pastor would say that to somebody else on staff? And people having to share those stories and then people being willing to believe it. So when you ask me, what should the church be doing? People who know that there's racism happening in the pews, in the churches, in those boardrooms, they need to be honest and say, I've seen it.
Yeah.
Whether it happened to them or not, I've seen it. This is real. These things are said. And then people need to believe it and they need to support it. What is disheartening is the same thing that's disheartening for women when they say, hey, I'm not being hired for this position, not because I'm not qualified, not because I don't have the education, but solely because of my gender. People need to believe Black people when they say, this is happening, and it's not because I'm not qualified. It's not because I don't have the same experience. It's happening because of the color of my skin.
Mm-hmm.
And as difficult as it was for people to believe that these things would happen to people because of their gender, I understand that people may be saying, well, I just can't believe that would happen. Well, if you believe that it happens to women, you have to believe that it happens to people because they're Black or because they're Latino or
Mm-hmm.
because they're Asian or because they're Native American. It happens.
Right.
And so we need the church to just believe.
Yeah.
You know, people have been saying that that the relationship between the Black community and police is unhealthy, dangerous. And people are like, oh, well, that can't be the case. That can't be the case. I've never experienced that. I know you haven't. But you've also never experienced someone saying, oh, what a sweet idea, and patting you on the shoulder in a staff meeting because you're a woman. You've also not experienced someone saying, looking around, being in a room full of all men and saying, hey, Heather, can you take the minutes because you're the only woman in the room, right? So just like that happens. And is that overt sexism? Well, it depends on who you're talking to. Some people consider that very subtle. Oh, well, just shake that off. That shouldn't bother you. So let me share a story with your listeners.
Yeah.
So I went to the bank with my daughter. I had just gotten a tax refund, right? You know, when that was a thing. And when in person was a thing and you could go to a bank,
Yes,
right?
when you could walk into a bank.
Right. And so I'm there and I'm going to make a withdrawal. And because we had something we were going to use that money for. So I went in to make a withdrawal, a sizable withdrawal. And I hand my driver's license to the teller. And the teller looks at it, asks me to sign a form. In Michigan, we have what's called an enhanced driver's license, so you can drive straight to Canada. That's what I have. And the teller looked, thought about it, and said, do you have another piece of ID? And I said, yeah, I have another piece of ID. So I took out my passport card. For those that don't know, a passport card is just like a passport. You use it if you're on a cruise, something like that. So I hand that. She calls the manager over. The manager says, what is this? And I said, it's a passport card. She looks bewildered. Well, I've never seen one of these before. Well, apparently you've never needed one before.
That's
but
so strange.
Right? Okay. So then she says, well, what are you going to use the money for? I'm going to use it for something. I don't understand. Well, do you have any more ID? So then I took out my ministerial license and I took out my bar card that says I'm an attorney. Well, so you're an attorney here in the state of Michigan? She asked me. Yeah. Well, why do you need so much money? Ma'am, I'm making a withdrawal. And at this point, I said, I'm going to actually move these funds to another account. Well, and so she questions me about being an attorney. Yes, I'm an attorney. Well, what kind of law do you practice? I'm listed in the state bar directory. Oh, that's true. So then she looks me up in the state bar directory. She checks to see if the address matches the address on my license. Then she says, well, what's your phone number there and what's your email? And I realize that this woman does not believe I am who I am. And I also see my daughter sitting over there.
Mm.
And I am incensed. I'm enraged that it's taking this because the people behind me are starting to stare at me like, oh, is she a criminal? I wonder what's about to happen. And I realize that any minute now, if I'm not careful, they're going to call the police on me and I'm going to get handcuffed. I'm going to get taken out of the bank and my daughter is going to be put in temporary foster care because I'm there by myself, right? Because that's what happens if they arrest you and you have a minor. And so I try to be really patient and I try to answer all of her questions. And finally she's like, well, okay, I see where it matches here in the state. Well, I guess we can go ahead and give it. So she gives me back all the ID, and then she gives me the money, and I leave the bank, and I am shaking
Yeah.
because I've had to keep myself together in order for this not to escalate. Well, probably a month and a half later at a different branch of the same bank in a neighboring state, a Black man was arrested for cashing his work check. They called the police on him for fraud, which was exactly what I was afraid would happen to me. So imagine living in that tension every day, where the simplest encounter could escalate beyond your wildest imagination and wondering what's going to happen. You know, if I'm getting followed at the store, is someone going to accuse me of something? And is that going to put me in danger? And if I've got my daughter with me, what could happen to her if that happens? In ministry, particularly because I belong to a predominantly white denomination, that will not have meetings in some small town somewhere. And if I'm driving, can I drive by myself? Do I need to ride with other people? What happens if my car breaks down on the way and I'm in the middle of nowhere, both as a woman and as a Black person? What could happen to me? And those are very legitimate fears. And if you've not had to live with that kind of pressure, then you may not understand why people are so angry. Because we have a man who was killed because they thought he was passing a counterfeit $20 bill. Even the lowest paid police officer probably had a $20 bill in their wallet. And the thought that this man didn't see another person, he didn't see someone made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And so I think the church needs to wrestle with the dehumanization that was taught from pulpits during slavery, and how, even though it's not a policy, it's still a practice to teach dehumanization. People didn't understand why Black folks were outraged when they made pictures of Michelle and Barack Obama look like monkeys. And the issue is, and I heard Dr. Anita Phillips say this so eloquently, when you dehumanize a person, that's what allows you to take their life. She talked about the example of the Holocaust, how the Jews were referred to as rats. If you begin to look at people as animals, then you can treat them that way. And so if you refer to Black folks in language that is dehumanizing, then you can treat them any kind of way, because it doesn't matter. Because that's the only way you can be that inhumane to people, is if you dehumanize them, if you don't see them as full people.
Yeah.
And in our Constitution, we were literally only 3/5 of the person, right? So that dehumanization is long in the minds of America as a country. And we have to actively fight that. We have to actively preach against it, teach against it, not only in our churches, but in our homes. People think that they can be silent about race. I don't want to have to have that conversation with my daughter. I don't want to have that conversation with my son. I just want them to grow up innocent and pure. Your silence is still teaching them, because you're teaching them that we don't talk about it. We can't talk about it. It's scary to talk about it. And the problem is, if you don't talk about it, you're letting someone else teach your child. And most Christian women would be appalled to think that they left their sex education up to a public school, up to the newscasters, up to broadcast television. You wouldn't leave your sex education up to Netflix for your kid.
Mm.
So why would you leave the education of race up to Netflix, up to the media, up to the neighbors next door?
Mm. That's so good, Shannon. Oh my goodness. There's so much that you just shared that I want to expand on. I'm thinking to what you're sharing about specifically what happens in our churches and the segregation, really, of our churches. Could you speak to that issue?
Sure.
Because you have experience with that, obviously.
Well, I'm going to start with a little bit of history. So you have to
Yeah.
understand that in in the beginning of our country, people did worship together. This phenomenon of segregated churches happened because there were white parishioners who said, you know what? If we worship with these slaves, if we worship with these free Black people, they're going to think they're equal to us. We will not have this. And they begin to protest. And so you begin to see denominations form. That is the origin of the Southern Baptist Church. That is the origin of churches like the CME Church and other churches like that. Because what happened was they said the Black people began to come in and they told Absalom Jones, you can no longer worship in this church. So he asked if he could be credentialed in the Episcopal Church, if I have this correct. Please don't quote me on this one. I believe it's the Episcopal Church. And so he was ordained and he started a Black Episcopal Church. Why? Because they were no longer allowed to worship together. Now, let's fast forward a little bit. And well, even in the origins of the Assemblies of God Church, the Assemblies of God Church started in the Pentecostal revival on Azusa Street. When they decided they were going to form churches together, the Southern white minister said, we can't do this down here. Our parishioners will leave us if they think that we are race mingling. And so they said, we're going to have our own denomination. So there you see the split from the Church of God in Christ and the Assemblies of God Church. And then in my own denomination, they had a practice, not necessarily policy, but a practice where they would not ordain Black people. What they said was, well, you know what? We understand that you want to be a minister. And there's this wonderful denomination around the corner called the Church of God in Christ. Why don't you go there? So you can see this feeding of ministers where they're like, hey, it's great that you want to be a minister. Go to that Black church. That's how we got the Black church.
Yeah.
So historically, then, we have decades of worshiping separately. Now, fast forward to the church growth movement. There's something called the homogeneous unit principle, where they tell you if you're a church planner, the fastest way to get your church to grow is grow around and get people that are just like the church you want to create. So if you want a middle class suburban church, then make sure you've got everybody and you make your team look like that. And you do that and you can grow your church fast and you'll have this amazing church. Well, what does that mean? That means you're not looking for diversity. You're not going to have a diverse team. You're not going to try to pull in diverse people. You're not going to use diverse music because I want to have this mega church. And the fast way to do it is make sure everybody thinks alike, probably votes alike, sends their kids to the same school, listens to the same kind of music. Then I can have this great harmonious experience in Christ. But what that does is that puts me around a lot of ears and I don't have any noses. Puts me around a lot of feet. I don't have any knees. So I'm not getting the full body of Christ experience. But that was taught in seminaries. If you want to grow your church, this is what you do. So now fast forward it now where we have people that have never worshiped with someone who's different from them. And they think, well, that's just because Black people don't want to worship with us. That's because Hispanic people don't want to worship with us. Not recognizing the origin of segregation and racism at the root of this. There's a wonderful book by Jamar Tisby called The Color of Compromise that discusses this. Okay. Wonderful book called Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson that talks about this. And you can see it from these sociologists and they lay the case out for you as to how we got here. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to be uncomfortable? Because it's uncomfortable to listen to music. If you've ever been on a mission trip, you notice like someone's worshiping in a language that's different from you. The way that they worship, where they worship, everything is completely foreign to you. And for a lot of people, that's their first time being a minority.
Yeah.
Because they've never had to adjust themselves. They've never had to be the one to make the adjustment around the food, around the volume of the music. And so now all of a sudden they're like, oh, I don't want to be offensive. I don't want to be offensive. Imagine having to live that way every day. Because that's what it means to be a minority in this country. You're constantly trying to figure out how not to offend in these predominantly white spaces. And that is exhausting. And so oftentimes you'll say to yourself, it's just easier if I go to the predominantly Black church. It's easier if I live in the predominantly Black neighborhood. It's easier if, because this other thing is really hard. The other thing to keep in mind is something called redlining. If people are unfamiliar with that, that is a public policy that was on the books for decades. And what happened was I want to say this happened after World War II. Again, I'm not a historian, but there was a policy by realtors and banks that they drew a red line on a map in various cities around the US. And that's the only place that they would allow Black people to live. And they would not give loans for people to buy homes. And they would not help people move out of those areas. People often are like, well, why are all Black people, why aren't they moving somewhere else? Because of redlining, because they didn't have a choice. When your grandfather was getting a GI loan, having come back from World War II and able to buy that beautiful house with that GI Bill, my grandfather was not eligible for the GI Bill. They would not give him one, which means the way that you gain generational wealth in this country is you buy a home, you live in a better neighborhood, that home appreciates, you then are able to then pass that money on to your children who then go, they buy a home in a nice neighborhood and they pass the generational wealth. Well, if you live in a place that is depressed because they say, oh, this place is devalued because no one wants to live here, but then they don't allow you to live anyplace else, then you don't have the generational wealth to pass on. And then if you look historically in Black communities, there's always been this periodic destruction, whether it was a massacre that happened in Tulsa with Black Wall Street, or whether it was taking highways and running them. If you look at the history of most cities, you'll see that there was a thriving Black community and then a highway was put in. And then those homes in that neighborhood was demolished. So just about the times that these people were beginning to gain that kind of wealth, the communities were destroyed. That explains the wealth gap in this country. Which then explains why kids living in certain neighborhoods have worse education, because if you're getting the money to fund the schools from the tax base, and these communities have been generationally underfunded. And I just want to use this example for your listeners. And that is, so my husband and I get ready to buy a house. So now this is the 2000s. My husband gets there first. The realtor is so excited to show him the home, not our realtor, the buyer, the seller's realtor. And the woman says to my husband, I'm so glad we're selling to you and your wife and not one of those Black families from the north side of Flint. Now, she's not seen me because I hadn't gotten off work yet. So then I show up. My husband is beet red. He's so angry. And he looks at me and said, there's no way we're buying this house. So what I want your folks to understand is that this kind of steering and these kind of things still happen because they were part of the practice in the real estate business for years.
Yeah.
For years. It doesn't have to be a law if people still do it. You know, it's kind of like oh, sure, we're open to women in ministry. You can have any position, but they only hire women for children's pastors.
Right.
Right? I mean, so it doesn't matter that you don't have a law on the books saying that we won't hire women. Your practice is saying where you have limited and restricted women too.
Yeah.
So oftentimes, these things are not de jure, they are de facto. They're a practice of not letting Black people move into a neighborhood. They're a practice of being very suspicious and dealing with Black people a certain way on a job, of hiring one Black person. Like, okay, we'll hire one, we'll see what happens. But if you haven't changed the culture and you haven't made it more inviting and you haven't created an environment where this person can thrive, then it's just like hiring that one woman on the team, but you're not doing anything that's going to help her be successful. And then you wonder why she quit. We just can't seem to keep Black staff at our churches. We can't seem to keep Black families. Well, you have to ask yourself, what have you done to really make it comfortable? What part of your culture are you willing to change so that they don't have to change all of who they are to be accepted?
Right.
I told someone once, you can't just want my Black skin and not my Black leadership. Don't just want to tick a box. Because the women, we know what it's like. Oh, we got a woman on the committee, so we can tick the box. But don't say anything. Don't bring up any issues. Don't change anything that's going on. Well, you can't invite a Black person to be a part of something and not want them to be fully present. So just imagine what that's like when someone brings you on a church staff. Oh, we're so excited. We've got this new worship leader because that's a safe place to put Black leadership is in the music department. I'm just going to say it. Right? It's like, that's where we're going to diversify our staff. I'm like, but don't you think that Black person could be over the youth ministry? Don't you think that Black person could be your executive pastor? Don't you think that Black person could be your accountant? Or is it that you don't see Black people that way? Because see, I have been in buildings of churches and the only time I saw Black faces were on the missions posters. You are sending a clear signal that that's how you see Black people, is in the recipient, in a non-lead position. And you're sending that message to everybody around you.
Yeah.
You have to look at what you're doing and saying, what is the message that we believe? And is everything around us sending the message saying that, yes, we want you, we value you, we celebrate you? Because you do that for families. You look around a church building, you're going to see those pictures, all the different places. We celebrate children, you'll see those pictures. We celebrate ministry, you'll see that. So then what else are you doing to say, hey, we celebrate you here, we want you here? And I think the other thing that Christians, white Christians, are going to have to wrestle with right now is the fact that this is really uncomfortable. My husband probably said it best. He grew up in the white Christian bubble, went to white Christian school for undergrad. And he said, my Sunday school teachers never talked to me about this. The people that led me to Christ never had these kind of conversations. And I am having to unlearn what they taught me. Not necessarily explicitly, but the lessons they taught me implicitly. The things that were unspoken cultural rules that became the norm in my heart. And I'm going to have to unlearn this. And I think that white Christians have to come to a place where they're like, God, search my heart. Show me what's in there. I don't think that I'm racist. I don't think that I'm biased. I don't think I have these prejudices. But I need you to show me my heart. I need you to show me what's going on inside so that I can see what's really there. I need you to show me that. And that's really uncomfortable because no one wants to think they're a bad person. No one wants to think that they could feel that way or be that way. But the issue is, you may never be a police officer that puts your knee in the neck of someone, but are you the person in charge of hiring that's going to hire this person because they remind you of your niece and not that other person because she's got a funny name that's hard for you to pronounce? You may not shoot somebody because you went into their house on a no-knock warrant, but are you the person that's going to hold your purse a little tighter because you're afraid of somebody because you've been taught that people that look like that are dangerous and scary? Are you not going to let your kids play or spend the night over at that house because, well, you just wouldn't, would you? Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to have some conversations about the private jokes that are told behind closed doors, the stereotypes that are encouraged behind closed doors, and really ask yourself, why am I okay with that? Why am I okay with Uncle Phil telling that joke at Thanksgiving? And why have I not spoken up? And what message is that sending my children?
Yeah.
What message is that sending when I don't stand up for it? If I'm a teacher, do you think that every kid in your class has the ability to be the next president of the United States or be the next CEO of a pharmaceutical company? Or when you see that little kid, are you saying to yourself, they're probably just going to go be troublemakers? I mean, these biases affect Black people in every area of our life. I have had so many friends who grew up in predominantly white churches tell me stories about things that were said to them at church camp, things that were said to them by Sunday school teachers. And it is appalling. It is unnerving to think that these things can happen in a context where people love God. But coming from Pentecostal tradition, one of my favorite professors at the school was South African. And he often talked about growing up during apartheid and him saying, I never once heard a sermon, a prophetic word against apartheid, and that apartheid was a sin. I think what America has to wrestle with the fact that in Christianity, white culture may be more preeminent than Jesus is.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is of utmost importance, the idea of us needing to have conversations with God, first and foremost, to ask, like you're saying, ask him to show us where we may have things in our heart that we didn't even realize. But then also being willing to have the uncomfortable conversations with other people.
Let me just share this. That same professor, the same South African professor, told a story in class about he has a granddaughter who has Down syndrome. And he's a really big guy. He's about like 6'4", big guy, big booming voice, right? And he talked about how he saw some kids, mistreating his granddaughter. And how he went over and he stood and he put his arm around her and he stood right next to her to say, I'm with her. I'm protecting her. And that could have easily put him in harm's way, depending on who he did that with, right? My question to my white Christian brothers and sisters are, Are you willing to lock arms with your Black brothers and sisters in a way that could inconvenience you and could possibly even harm you? Everybody's like, oh, I would have marched with Martin Luther King. But would you have walked with him on the Pettus Bridge and been willing to be hosed with water and had dogs attack you? Because Instagram activism is super easy. Facebook posts are easy.
Yeah.
Are you willing to be that person to stand up and say, this isn't right, if it could cost you your job, if it could cost you your social status, if it could cost you friendships? Because Jesus sat among sinners and he was willing to be called all kinds of names. He was willing to do all of that. And to me, that's the kind of sacrificial Christianity that isn't preached about loudly, but is truly necessary in times like these.
Mm-hmm.
There are people that gave their lives in the 60s, that gave their lives during the Civil War, because they're like, this is not just my belief. This is what Christianity really is.
Yeah.
You know, are you willing to lay your life down for your friends? People are saying, oh, there are people out there rioting, they're looting. You know, how can this be right? And what I would say is, but chances are, and I'm just going to say this, chances are, if the people that were marching looked different, I don't think the police would be out there with batons and rubber bullets. I'm from Michigan, and I saw people march because they were upset that the governor had quarantined the state. And they marched armed with AK-47s and rifles into the Capitol building, and nothing happened to them. If those same people were marching in front and saying we're against police brutality, I don't think those police would show up with rubber bullets and batons and tear gas. There is truly a visible difference in the way that some people are treated. And is the rioting and looting good? No. But Trevor Noah said it this way. He said, you know, in America, we believe that there's a social contract that the country has with its citizens. Before there was an America, there was a social contract that Britain was supposed to have with its subjects. And when we thought it was failed, there was protesting that led to war, right? Because the social contract had been broken. And right now, what you're seeing is people saying the social contract has been broken. What do we need from the church? We need the church to rise up and say the same thing. The social contract was broken, and we stand with our brothers and sisters. We believe in democracy. We believe in this republic. We believe in its ideals. We believe that America truly can be America, land of the free, home of the brave. And we believe that applies to every citizen. And we will march and we will speak up until that is a reality for all of the citizens of this country. But I need people to be as passionate about this change as they were about the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
And to not let it have to this passion only come up because someone died. Dear God, we don't need anybody else dying. We need people to say, this is unjust. I see it. I didn't see it before, but I see it now. And I'm going to make the necessary changes. And it has to be systemic. It can't just be, well, I'm going to just do my part. That's good, but we need to change the practices and we need to change the policies. Mm-hmm. You know, you saw people saying, I'm only going to hire a crew if it's 50% female. You see Hollywood saying that, you know, we're going to make sure that we have more actors who are and directors in these roles. We're going to make sure that we do all of these things. And that is just so critical that we say the same thing in the church, that we're going to have these conferences, but we're going to make sure we have Black voices. We're going to do these things, but we're going to make sure that we have Black representation. And we're going to make sure that these voices are heard and we're going to amplify them. And then we can see some change.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk just for a couple minutes about the practical, like you're talking about, you know, things actually changing. And I'll just speak from my experience because this is kind of where I'm at and it's challenging. So again, I'm in Maine. I think we're like the second most white state in the nation. And so naturally in my church, for example, we have a few Black people, but very few. I don't think there are any Black churches in our in our region at all. To be honest, there are a few pockets in the state, and as you get further south, where there is more diversity. But on a practical level, even just thinking about women wanting to have these conversations and have diversity, for example, in their friendships. For someone who is in a region where there is very little diversity, which probably the majority of listeners are in much more diverse neighborhoods. So that's great. But I guess I hear different messages, and I would love to know your perspective. Because on one hand, I hear the message of we need to seek out the Black voices and the minority voices and amplify them, or we need to intentionally create diversity in our churches, like you're saying, on staff or even in our relationships. And then on the other hand, sometimes I hear, don't reach out to me just because I'm Black, or don't, ask for my opinion just to get the Latino opinion on your board or whatever. And so I feel like there's a tension there, and it's challenging.
Sure.
And that's a big question. So I don't know, but I would love to hear your recommendations for navigating that tension for those of us who are in the majority and maybe that we do want to see change happen.
Sure. I think that latter part comes out of people that don't have relationships with folks. And what they're saying is, I don't know you. So
Yeah.
I want you to do some work first. Don't just come to me, like cultivate some relationships. And then it's not about you just, oh, I'm going to ask so-and-so because they're Black. I'm asking so-and-so because they're my friend and they're Black and I value their perspective.
Okay.
And so I think that's where that's coming from. When I've had people just out of blue, like, well, hey, you're Black. Tell me, like, I don't even know your name. Like, what? Like, who are you?
Right. Okay.
And so that to me is where that comes from.
Yeah.
When you are in a predominantly white situation, which I live in Michigan, there are plenty of areas in my state that are all white, right?
Yeah.
That, no diversity of any kind, regardless of which ethnic direction the compass may be pointing.
Yeah.
And so what do? I think what you do is you start educating yourself, right? You can be what I call a fully-formed Christian around this issue just because of the books you read and the voices that are speaking into your life, right? So I would challenge your listeners, like, what Christian authors are you reading that are not white? Kind of like the way you might ask some Christian pastors, like, what Christian books have you read by a female author?
Yeah.
Have you read any of those female voices? What podcasts are you listening to? Whose voices are speaking to you around this issue? It's kind of like, I know you've had these leadership conversations. Well, I can't get a mentor because I live in the middle of nowhere. Well, no, but people can mentor you through their authorship, through listening to their sermons and their speeches. And it's the same thing. If you're listening to some of these voices, you're going to hear stuff. You're going to be challenged on stuff, even though you may not be able to walk that out practically in your day to day, in the sense of, you're going to have this person of color you're going to be interacting with and that sort of thing. But what you can do then is, because you're learning from these other perspectives, when you hear things that are contrary to Scripture, contrary to the heart of God, you then be armed with this new knowledge that you've gained to be able to say, that perspective isn't quite accurate. Let me help you see something differently. And so you can begin to change things even in a predominantly white or all white community, just by having those other voices and learning from those other voices. You're going to hear some things that you're going to agree with. You're going to hear some things you're like, that can't be true. But listen, adopt that listening posture. We've heard those stories of women who cried rape when it wasn't true. And then we all go, oh, you've taken down the cause for all of us, by making this false accusation. The same thing's going to happen. You're going to read some stuff and you're going to be like that. And you're going to find it later like, oh, that wasn't right. Guess what? Black people are not a monolithic group.
Yeah.
Right. Just like women are not a monolithic group. And so I can't tell you that every book you're going to pick up is going to be fabulous and it's going to completely agree with your doctrine, but keep listening and keep seeking out those voices.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. I also loved what you shared earlier about the Instagram activist or the Facebook posts. And the thing that I've seen, and this is maybe more applicable to, because I'm in the online business space, and I've seen a huge amount of pressure on business owners to speak up and to say something, and that silence is complicity, essentially. Then I've seen people speak up and say something and be torn apart because they used the wrong words in the wrong way, or maybe they didn't have it right. And then they tried to apologize. And it's been very sad to see that happening. And I understand the need to speak up, but I guess, could you speak more to the whole issue of the pressure to speak up versus the needing the time to process and really do the inner work before speaking
Right.
up? You know?
They always talk about in leadership books, this idea that during a crisis, communication is key. Communicate, 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 communicate frequently, communicate often, communicate a lot, communicate in all the ways you can communicate.
Yeah.
So this is still true. So as a business leader, you need to communicate. This is a crisis. It's a crisis with COVID-19. That hasn't stopped yet.
Yep.
Goodness, right? It's a crisis what's going on in our nation related to, these, what some people might refer to as an uprising, right?
Mm-hmm.
I prefer that term. It kind of reminds me of the Arab Spring, right? Just,
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing some new things now. So what would I say? I'm going to use the example of Lily Pulitzer, right? Lily Pulitzer put out a statement and it was really pretty, just like Lily patterns. The problem was it didn't speak to the issue at all. And so people are kind of like, what in the world are you doing,
Mm-hmm.
Lily? Like, this doesn't you're not addressing anything.
Yeah.
And so they went back and they put out a second statement. And this time they got it right. Now, was it enough for some people? Probably not. But, you've got to be okay with the fact that this may be the first time you've ever stepped into this space. So you may not get it right. Number two, I don't know how diverse Lily's staff is. I don't know if they had people they could bounce it off of to say, hey, is this the right thing? Which goes back to a bigger issue, which is just the fact that maybe if you had some of those voices around the table, you could have gotten it right the first time. So you have to ask yourself, do you have the relationships that will allow you to get good information? But, do you have to say something? Yes, you do. You do have to say something. Might you need time to process? Sure, you probably do need time to process. But I like what somebody said, and that is, everybody used to say, oh my goodness, we could never do that. It would take so much time. But it was amazing to see how nimble companies were with COVID-19.
We get emails from every single company I've ever bought anything from.
Exactly. Like everybody figured out how to say something and to do it quickly. Maybe not the next day. Maybe it took them a week. Sometimes maybe it took them 2 weeks or so. But everybody figured out how to say something. So I can't let people off the hook by saying, oh, no, we know you need time to process. But if you could figure out how to do it for a pandemic, you can figure out how to do it for this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you may have to look at your structures and your institutions to see if you have the right people that can help you craft the right statement, because there are missteps being made. But here's the thing. Your clients want to hear from you. Your customers want to hear from you. And we want to know that you're trying. Did Lily's first misstep and second approach mean that I'm never going to buy anything Lily again? No. What it means is I'm probably going to write a note saying, thank you for the correction. But this points me to the fact that there may be some bigger issues inside of your company that you may want to try to figure out.
Right, right. I think that what I've seen that seems to be helpful is just like you said, adopting that posture of listening, and even just saying, I don't know what to say right now, but I'm listening, is probably better than not saying anything.
I mean, we saw a misstep with Andy Stanley. And so then he stepped back and said, you know what? I'm listening. I adore Andy Stanley and Sandra Stanley. I just think they're just the world's cutest little couple, right? And I feel like I've learned a lot from them. I'm not going to cancel Andy Stanley because he made a misstep.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's something that white people have to understand is that I told a group yesterday I was meeting with, I was like, let me let you off the hook. You're so afraid of saying the wrong thing, you won't say anything. Guess what? You probably already said the wrong thing 100 times and we still managed to still be in relationship with you. So it's okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We're not expecting you to get it right, but we're expecting you to participate in the journey.
Yeah.
So participate, recognizing, hey, you may get this wrong. And then what this is going to force you to do is then build the relationships where you can say, hey, you're my friend. We have a relationship. What do you think? And get a bunch of different takes. Because again, we're not a monolithic group. And so one person may tell you, hey, this is outstanding. And another person may be like, oh my gosh, this was a perfect thing. And getting that multiplicity of perspectives from the Black experience is going to help you. Then you can then listen to all this and say, okay, so now what's the right tone for my company or for me personally?
So Shannon, I am just so grateful for you taking the time to share in this conversation with me personally, but also with our listeners, because I think it's so valuable. Everything you've shared has been really valuable. And I think that we could have a whole separate conversation, because I still want to talk about the issue of the church and you navigating, leading through a church merger. Like there's so much more we could dive into. But is there any last words that you would want to share about the issue of race and the racial tensions in our country and moving forward before we move on to wrapping things up?
Yes, I think the biggest thing is, you know, this is not happening by itself. It's happening in the context of a pandemic, right?
Yes.
And at the beginning of this pandemic, all we wanted were for things to go back to normal. It's like, I just want in person to be a thing again. I want hugs to be something that we do, right? Like I want this sense of normalcy. And then in the middle of a pandemic that seemed to be never ending, then we had this. We had
Yeah.
Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and there are others that, so I want to caution your listeners about the rush to normalcy, because everybody just wants to feel comfortable again. We just want to feel normal again. We just want to be able to breathe easy again. And it may be that we are living in a time like the 60s where we may not be able to breathe easy for a while. And we're going to have to be comfortable being uncomfortable and wrestling with things and solving problems that the previous generations didn't solve, so that we can truly get to a place of harmony. But we're this feeling of, oh, I'll be glad when this is over. Well, it's not going to be over. It's not going to be over until it gets resolved. Think of it like being pregnant and having a baby, right? It's not over until the baby's actually delivered. Like, it doesn't matter how much your ankles are swollen and your feet hurt and your back hurts and you're tired and you're like, I just want to be done with this. Well, you're done with it when it's done. Not one day sooner, not
Right.
one day later. And so, as uncomfortable as it is, as difficult as it is, as hard as it is, you're just going to just have to sit with this, because I've been Black a long time and I've had to sit with it. You'll be okay being uncomfortable for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months, however long it takes to get this right. Because if it was your kid that was in danger of being called a racial slur, you'd want people to get it right. If it was you that might not get a job because people were prejudging you, you'd want people to get it right and to take the time to get it right. So be willing to do that. If it was your church where you didn't feel welcome completely, you'd want them to take the time to get it right. So I need people to be willing to put in the time and get it right.
Yeah. Embrace being uncomfortable. That's what we've got to do. And that's not something, at least here in the US, that we love doing. So, all right. Thank you, Shannon, so much for that. We always wrap things up with leaders or learners. And I always love to hear what you're learning. Like, what is something that you're learning right now? It could be a resource that you'd want to share with our audience, or it could just be a lesson God is teaching you. But what is something you're learning right now?
So interestingly enough, there are 2 books. Both are written by men. So I need some more good chick female leadership stuff out there. But in the meantime, Leadership Pain by Sam Chan and Carrie Newhouse book. I didn't see this. You didn't see this. I didn't see this coming. You didn't see it coming?
Yes, I didn't. I have it. I should know.
Right? Right?
Yes, I believe I didn't see this coming.
Yeah, these 2 books, right? Because nobody saw this coming.
Yeah. True.
What do you do when you didn't see nobody saw the pivot to online church in the way that nobody saw this coming, right? So what do you do about the things you didn't anticipate? And then Leadership Pain by Sam Chan, because the highest level of leadership you'll get to is the highest level of pain you're willing to tolerate.
Wow.
As leaders, we have to be willing to tolerate a higher level of pain. Sheep bite. This is hard. you have to work with people who say things and you're just like, I thought you said you knew Jesus. That could not have been something that was inspired by God, right? You gotta, right? And you're hiring people that say they know Jesus, and you're just like, Jesus told you not to complete that assignment, right? Like it's like you're doing. And so as leaders, there's a certain level of pain that we have to be comfortable with. We have to grow into.
Yeah.
And so those are two things that are helping me. I think one other thing I'll mention, Robert Morris, his new book that deals with Sabbath. I think as female leaders, self-care is really important, and it starts with Sabbath. And particularly if you're juggling a multitude of things, if you're juggling work and family. Some of us became teachers, right? Because school stopped. I became a first grade teacher. Who knew? Right. And so you're juggling all these things. So Sabbath is really important. Finding that time for soul care and rest and having that become part of your routine, even in the middle of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And especially for those listeners that are people of color, if you're Black, if you're Indigenous, like soul care is so critical right now.
Yeah.
So I feel like those are three things that I'm learning.
Mm-hmm. I love that you mentioned that, because last week's episode was all about rest and getting the type of rest that you need. And I think it's so vital for the moment of time we are in. So thank you, Shannon, again, for your time and for being with us today. If people want to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
So they can find me on social media at Dr. Shannon Polk on Instagram, on Twitter, all those things. If you want to learn a little bit more about me, you can go to my website, which is shannonpolk.com.
Perfect. And I will have the links to those in the show notes so people can click right over and learn more.
Awesome.
So thanks again for being with us and for sharing on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.